So eastern forests are known for being very diverse and having a wide diversity of deciduous tree species. Though a lot of old growth forests and eastern forests that were cleared early on and may have disappeared, we also have a lot of species that are some key species that are missing from eastern forests as a result of exotic pathogens. So two big examples of this involve chestnut blight and Dutch elm disease. Um, let's talk about chestnut blight first. Chestnuts used to be large components of many eastern forests. The map here shows the progress of chestnut blight from 1904 through 1950 in eastern forests. This blight is an ascomycete from East Asia. It was imported to the Northeast US and then just kind of took off and ran rampant. Chestnuts are now in these forests now reduced to small resprouting shrubs, almost really tiny trees that will, produce new leaders every year, but never really get very large before they encounter the blight. There are native species in China that are somewhat resistant, and so there are a number of hybrid programs that are trying to reintroduce chestnut to eastern forests, and so we're hopeful that one day we'll have chestnut trees back in eastern forests. But for the time being, it's been a major influence and a major change in eastern forests. So here's some examples. Here we've got a historic photo of a large American chestnut tree in New York. And similarly, here's and then after the blight, many of these trees died, and so we have a forest formerly dominated by chestnut in the other photo here, where after chestnut had completely been wiped out. Another disease, it's a really important one for eastern tree species, is Dutch elm disease. It's brought to North America through imported wood products, and so importing wood products brought along beetles that would spread this fungus. And so this is an example of a multiple species interaction that had a really detrimental effect on elms in the US and in eastern forests. So here's another big example. So I think the take home here is that the forests that we see today, and in fact some of these forests that have been most studied in terms of understanding ecosystem processes and community processes, these forests had already been affected by chestnut blight and Dutch elm disease. So the very forests that we're studying as examples of how forests work have already been affected by anthropogenic influences, spreading of pathogens, and probably now climate change. But all of this before we really get busy studying them. So that puts in context and should humble us a little bit when we think about how forests work, because if the major players have already been removed, then it's a different scene. And this also is maybe some foreshadowing for things that as forest ecologists we need to look out for in the future, because it's possible that there are, of course, different pathogens that will come along, and species that now are so dominant in our forests we take them for granted could potentially be affected by as yet unknown pathogens. Okay, let's move to the west. I'm going to move to forests of the west now. Let's talk about Ponderosa Pine forest. Ponderosa Pine is a really interesting species for the western US, here in the Northwest, but also throughout the Southwest and Rocky Mountain region. It's one of the most widely distributed tree species in the West. In California, this will kind of trade places with Jeffrey pine, both in terms of ecology and stand dominance. And so you get Jeffrey pine that can be a yellow bark species, somewhat fire resistant and fire adapted in Eastern California. Ponderosa pine really thrives in a bimodal low rainfall climate with cold winters here in the Northwest, where we have dry summers and cold winters. However, in the Southwest, it's also known for existing in places with predictable monsoon climates late in the summer. And this is part of its fire ecology. The same forces that bring in monsoon rains bring in summer thunderstorms, which can result in low intensity, high frequency wildfires. that will clear out forest understories in Ponderosa Pine forests, resulting in widely spaced, evenly spaced old trees and very few young or young that just come up episodically. The natural fire return interval for Ponderosa Pine can be pretty variable, from anywhere from every 3 years to every 10 or even every 30 years. There is a native Ponderosa Pine tree on the west side of the Cascades. Near Olympia, you can find representatives of this up on Joint Base Lewis McCord. You can also find them down in the Willamette Valley. Those trees clearly have a little bit longer fire return interval that they'd be associated with in the past. Although they're also near prairies, so it's possible the fire return interval was as frequent as every 3 to 10 years. Widespread across the U.S. now, forest managers are reintroducing fire and trying to restore the fire ecology of Ponderosa pine forests. And so for this reason, it's one of the species that you're most likely to encounter as a forest ecologist in terms of an active management approach that doesn't involve any logging necessarily, or if it does, it's cutting out trees for non-commercial reasons, but strictly for restoring an ecological pattern or one related to fire reintroduction. Let's skip across to another continent now. Let's talk really briefly about eucalyptus forests. So we've been talking a lot about what's happening in the U.S. forests and in the Northwest with Ponderosa pine. Another group that is famously referred to when we're talking about fire adaptations are eucalyptus trees. However, eucalyptus forests are composed of a really large diversity of species, especially in Australia. So within Australia alone, we're talking about something like 900 species in the 3 genera Eucalyptus, Corymbia, and Angophora. All of these might be referred to as eucalypt species, and it's a really diverse group. There are about 92 million hectares of eucalyptus forest in Australia, and this includes tropical forests, dry, almost Mediterranean forests, and temperate rainforests like we have here. So the eucalyptus forest can span that whole gamut. So they're very far away from being a type of forest that is monotypic. Many eucalypt species are adapted to environments in which drought or nutrient-poor soils and fire are really common, and in many forests in Australia, increasingly so. Almost all eucalypt species are native to Australia. They evolved generally from rainforest ancestors on the continent. One trait that many eucalypts share is an oil-rich foliage that burns readily. And so they display a range of strategies to survive and recover following fire, or adaptations to allow them to avoid fire damage in the first place. The majority of eucalypt species are evergreen and retain leaves year-round, and that occurs in the tropics, in temperate rainforest systems, and in drier systems. Here's some nice photos of forests in Australia and Tasmania. These are primarily from southeastern Australia, where the temperate rainforests are more dominant, and Tasmania, which is known for its really tall trees. Some of the record holders for tall trees can be found in Southeast Australia and Tasmania. And, yeah, so fascinating forests. We've got all sorts of neat stuff going on in these photos, including large fruit bats here. One of these photos shows a plantation, a blue gum eucalyptus that's replanted following clearing of native forests. We've got one of the tallest trees in the world, a Eucalyptus regnans, shown in some of these photos. Here's one of my collaborators wrapped in eucalyptus bark that peels off of Eucalyptus regnans in an old growth forest. So lots of interesting things associated with these tree species. Another temperate rainforest ecosystem that we might not think about immediately. When we think about temperate rainforests, especially in the Northwest here, we might immediately think of the Olympic Peninsula. But in fact, there are temperate rainforests not only in Australia and Tasmania, but in South America too. South American Valdivian temperate rainforests are famously impenetrable, dense forests with high summer moisture in addition to high winter moisture climates. These are diverse forests in many respects, and they tend to be composed of species that we're not used to seeing here in the Northern Hemisphere. I'll show you some images from forests in northern Patagonia, which is right here in just about central Chile near Puerto Varas. Patagonia, the Patagonia region is often referred to as stretching just into the north of this sound here, and represented by the temperate rainforest ribbon that you can see here in southern Chile. These forests tend to have predictable elevation gradients where you have certain species occurring at certain elevation bands, much like we have here in the Northwest. These can be extensive and complex forests with really complicated canopy structures. These are forests where species will be adapted to large disturbances associated with volcanic eruptions, especially in a very active portion of the Andes mountain range, and adapted to large disturbances associated with wildfire or landslides. In addition, these forests tend to be very strongly adapted to local tree fall gap dynamics, where the major disturbance for hundreds of years in many of these forests may be large trees falling over. All of that's similar to many of our Northwest forests, but there are some traits of these forests that are extremely different. One of them is that although these forests tend to be dominated by large trees with dense undergrowth, they also tend to be dominated by bamboos and trunk epiphytes that can be really, really dense on these trees and form some pretty unique structures. These forests are also unique in that they tend to have high rainfall even in the summer months. They have really high rainfall in winter months, and then can also have high rainfall in summer months. And so we've got a little climate graph that's shown here alongside some photos in some forests near Calbuco volcano near Ensenada in Chile. And finally, let's talk about our Northwestern rainforests. We're going to be spending a lot of time in Northwestern rainforests in the program for us. And so these are going to be the examples of large and structurally complex forests that we're going to be most used to seeing. So the rest of this preamble is kind of to put that in perspective. Our forests are really different here in the Northwest for a number of reasons. They're different in that they're dominated by large trees. Even our young forests can be dominated by large trees. They're different in the dominance of bryophytes and understories that can be somewhat sparse just due to the low light in dense old growth forests in particular. They're also unique in that the wood properties of many species that grow in our large forests render them such that they don't decompose that fast. So we end up with large woody debris, either as standing snags or logs down on the ground that don't decompose really quickly and instead stick around as structure and habitat for a variety of organisms. We're going to have a lot of time to talk about these forests, so this is just the beginning of it. Okay. Where I want to go next is I want to start talking about ecosystem development. So now that our brains are kind of primed to think about a whole bunch of different types of forests, in the next video, what I want to do is start walking into how forests develop through time and where the major thought on how forests develop through time came from. Where's the major theory? Who were the major players? And what are our major concepts about forest succession, both in the Northwest and in forests worldwide, in terms of energetics, carbon exchange, and species change through time.